Paramanando Sundaro Sundarapriyo. He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinabandhu Jagatpate Gopisha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namaste Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye. Shri Guru Vaishnava Guru Parampara ki jai. Śrī Advaita Chandra ki jai. Śrī Advaita Acharya Avirbhav Mahāmantra ki jai. Gaur Bhakta Vrinda ki jai. Gaur Premanande. Good evening, everyone. We gathered on the auspicious occasion of the appearance of Advaita Acharya, Srimad Advaita Acharya ki jai. So he is, of course, an important figure in the Leela of Caitanya Mahaprabhu. And there are many things that could be said about him, but I'll draw tonight from the verses, 2 verses of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, found in his Mangal Charn and his auspicious invocation to Chaitanya Charitamrita. And in those verses he speaks about the ontological position of Advaita Acharya, and who is spoken about further, obviously, in the texts, in the context of the narrative. He's a very prominent player, and we have discussed this before to some extent, but these verses seem appropriate for this evening. I'll recite them for you. They're original Sanskrit compositions, of Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami. Mahavishnu Jagatkarta Mayaya Ya Srijati Adha Dasya Bhakti Advaita Charjishvara Advaita Marinadvaita Acharjam Bhakti Samshanat Bhaktavartaramisham Tam Advaita Charjam Ashraye. So he says, Mahavishnu Jagatkarta. And he refers as well to Advaita here in these verses with the epithet Ishwar. So Ishwar means God, literally, and it means like the controller. So the will behind the world, so to speak. And Mahavishnu Jagatkarta here is described as a world maker. Jagatkarta. Karta means like to make, to do, a world doer, a world maker. So he's the principal agent of action behind the world. And identified with Mahavishnu, Mayaya Ya Srijati Adha. And Srijati refers to a particular Leela of Madhuvan, of the Godhead. Here, Leela of the Paramatma, called the Shrishti Leela. Leela of manifesting the world. It's said in the sutras of Vedanta to be something that occurs out of an exuberance and overflowing of joy. Lokavatu Lila Kaivalyam. The implication is that the world making, if you will, on the part of the Godhead is not something that is done out of any necessity on his part, other than the nature of the necessity that is attached to love itself. So love is fulfilling, but it has its own necessity. It has a necessity, for example, to share itself, to celebrate itself. Yeah. When you're in love, you want to tell other people about it. I met this guy, and he was fantastic. And you want to celebrate it, you want to share it. So the world is something like that. It is not something that the Godhead manifests out of anything that's lacking within him, any need, but out of fullness. So I'll read the translations at least. At any rate, Śrī Advaita Acharya is the avatar of Mahavishnu, who manifests the material world in conjunction with Maya. Because he is non-different from Hari, he is called Advaita. Because he propagates Bhakti, he is called Acharya. He is both God and the avatar of God in the form of a devotee. I take shelter of him. So again, Śrī Advaita is the avatar of Mahavishnu, who manifests the world, Maya Yasri Jatyata, in conjunction with Maya. So in our discussion this morning, based on a question from Prahlad Bhakta, this something about what's being described here, the implications of that constituted my reply to his inquiry. His inquiry was that it seems to say that some places that Advaita is Mahavishnu, some places says that he's Shiva, and so how do we balance this out? And so forgive me if there's some repetition in what I said this morning here, but it's worth reiterating. The idea here is that in order for the inanimate, achit, unknowing matter, whirl of matter, to have a life, so to speak, it requires the touch of consciousness. This is the idea. Without that, according to the Sankhya philosophy, the Bhagavad Sankhya, the matter is in a kind of a state of equilibrium and still. And so it's thought that while the matter is the ingredients of the world, and that's a partial cause of the world. Similarly, and also, I should say also, there is an instrumental cause. And I've given the example, the classic example of the pot and the potter, the clay pot and the potter. So the clay pot is made out of clay, and the clay is the cause of the pot in conjunction with the potter, who puts it on a wheel and spins it, and we have pottery, pot. So the Godhead is the instrumental cause, the potter, and material nature is the clay. So these two together. This is the basic idea of Vedanta. And the Mahavishnu is said to reflect upon the world by, it's described as glancing. His glancing means that he casts his will. Mahavishnu doesn't directly associate with matter. It's said in the Bible, I've heard, I never read it, but I think it's somebody who told me that said in the Bible that if a man casts his glance upon a woman, the implication is with some lustful desire, then he's gone there, so to speak. He's guilty or something like that. So It is said that Vishnu never associates with Maya, but he glances at her. He has nothing to gain from the Maya Shakti, obviously, from inner matter, but his glancing upon her, again, is his own exuberance to expand himself, the one desiring to become many. This is the will behind the world, if you will. The one desires to become many. It's another sense in which love is full, but seeks to expand itself. It's full and expanding at the same time. So the one becomes many. We are the many. And then the many are carried, metaphorically, poetically speaking, in the glance of Vishnu. So the glance itself has an ontological position, the will of Vishnu, and the jivas are in the glance. And so the jivas are kind of impregnated, this type of sensibilities are invoked in the text into the womb, the yoni of material nature, and then this causes the matter that's in equilibrium to move out of the equilibrium and start to have a motion of itself. And so, again, in the general sense, Vishnu is the instrumental cause and matter is the ingredient cause. But sometimes it's the way Krishnadas Kaviraj looks at it in explaining the ontological position of Advaitas is that he says that also the material nature itself can be looked at as both the instrumental and the efficient cause, or material cause. Instrumental and material cause, ingredient cause. And what does he mean by that? He says there's the pradhan, so this is like the modes of nature in equibalence. And then there's the goddess of Maya. The goddess of Maya is a shadow, if you will, of Ramadevi, the consort of the Mahavishnu, with whom he enters into Yoga Nidra. They sleep together in Yoga Nidra. Mystic.
With who does he do that?
With Ramadevi. Yeah. So she is Parashakti. Now the goddess personifying material nature develops some desire. The idea is this is to connect with her source, Ramadevi, whom she's a shadow of, in the context of causing the material world to go into motion, if you will. And so, because of that, this gives rise to Ramadevi and Mahavishnu bringing about, so to speak, the world through the glancing. In other words, the goddess presiding over material nature connects with Ramadevi, and Vishnu connect. They wake up and the world is set in motion. And so, because it's initiated, in a sense, by the goddess Maya, she's the instrumental cause. The instrumental cause is, again, desire here. So if you desire to have a pot, well, then you go and get the clay. But the desire is driving that which turns the clay into a pot, in the pottery, in the potter's example. So, and then he says the other side of it is that on Mahavishnu's side, who's in a more general sense thought to be the instrumental cause, with Maya as the ingredient cause, just as we can say within the material nature there is both ingredient and efficient cause, so within Vishnu, on the other side we can say there's both. He's both the ingredient and the efficient cause. So as the ingredient cause, as the efficient cause, instrumental cause, this is the Mahavishnu. And there is another manifestation of the Mahavishnu. Perhaps the very glance itself has an ontological position, as I say, contains the jivas, and that glance itself activates material nature. And that personified activation and instilling within nature a creative power is a second, an anga, he says. An anga. An anga means a limb of Mahavishnu. He says, not an amsa, but an anga. Amsa means a part, and anga means a limb. And what Krishnadas Kaviraj wants to say by this is that saying that he's a limb makes him more intimately connected. Like not an amsa of the Mahavishnu, which is more distant, but his own very part, like the arm is the limb of the body. So he makes a differentiation between anga and amsa, speaking of, in terms of affection, closeness, and so forth. And says this other manifestation, the second manifestation of Mahavishnu, is the anga of Mahavishnu. It's a particular expression of the Mahavishnu that presides over the pradhan, material nature, and invests creative power in it. Now, I gave the example this morning, it's worth repeating, that if you have a television set, it requires a viewer to turn it on. So, for example, in relation to matter, we kind of turn it on as the viewer, but matter has its own power, so to speak. Power of gravity or electromagnetic force or something like that. And so this kind of power is thought to be instilled in matter. Just like if you're watching a television, yes, it requires that you turn it on, but inside the television itself has some powers, has wires and connections and subtle waves and whatnot that cause the picture to show. So this is all the workings. It's kind of the unconscious workings. The consciousness is the viewer, and even there appears to be consciousness within it, it's all, you can just turn, just the television, you can just turn those. I mean, I'm just giving an example. So, the power of material nature, its own kind of force and power, independent of the jivas, this is instilled by Mahavishnu. And this particular form of Mahavishnu, he says, he appears as Advaita Acharya. So he appears to be connected, well, he's very intimately connected with the manifestation of the world, as I'm describing, with the glancing of Vishnu and so on and so forth. And the world, as we know, is, well, I said, Lokavatuli Kaivalyami. It's manifest out of joy, out of love. It's, and I've described it further out as the expression of compassionate love on the part of the Godhead. In the spiritual world, where's the question of compassion? But Narayan has a desire to bestow mercy, a form of mukti, sarupya, salokya, sharasti, samipya. So there needs to be a world for that. So the idea is that Vishnu, as in the form of the Purushas like Mahavishnu, and this special second form of Mahavishnu that Krishna, this is the only place we find this Krishna's Kaviraj's writing here in Chaitanya Charitamrita. This idea is very much a kind of a compassion personified, the very desire of compassion in Vaikuntha, played out in this way in the form of Mahavishnu and the Anga of Mahavishnu, whom Advaita is an incarnation of. Now, other authors, and early authors as well, have, like Kavi Karnapur, for example, has identified Advaita Acharya with Sadashiva. Sadashiva means a number of things. Shambhu means a number of things in different places. The terms are used. Shambhu often refers to the glancing of Vishnu. But one of the things that the Sadashiva refers to is you have the two sides of Shiva. You have Shiva manifested in this world as a guna avatar, and you have on the side of liberation, in the liberated world, beyond the Devi Dham is the Mahesh Dham, just before Vaikuntha Dham. And there Shiva is manifest as a devotee of Sankarshan in Vaikuntha, surrounded by other devotees. You go further, the Sadashiva is said to be manifest in Goloka as Chetrapal, the protector of the Dham, further described as Gopishwar, the form of Shiva in which Shiva was given in order to participate in the rasa dance of Krishna. And having had a desire to do so, he was given a form of a gopi and posted at the gate of the Rasa Leela to say who could come in, who can't come in. Well, Kavi Karnapur doesn't mention that, but in identifying Advaita with Sadashiva, he says that in his Gauraganadeshtipika, he says, and once it's mentioned in the Purana that Shiva, seeing Krishna and Balaram and their friends dancing in abandon in Sakyarasa, desired to experience that. And Krishna gave him a form as a cowherd boy in Goloka. So this is like many of the people, the spiritual figures in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, Shiva is rather complex as well. So he has a form as a gopa, he has a form as a gopa. That's not within our possibilities, but for Shiva, such things are possible. And this form, so this is where, for example, if you look at Gaudiya Vaishnavism and you take what Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami says here, which we should, he's identifying Advaita Acharya with a particular anga of Mahavishnu, and okay, he's compassionate, he calls Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to the world, he wants to distribute bhakti, so on and so forth. But then you might question, well, the bhakti that he gives, is it going to be a Vaikuntha kind of bhakti, Advaita? So this seems to be dealt with in Kavi Karnapur's work and in the work of, I guess, was it Kavi Karnapur also wrote another Chaitanya Chandrodaya Nataka, I believe, a drama about Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. I believe it was Kavi Karnapur. Yeah. Also identified with Sadashiva there. And then you get this connection of Advaita with Sakyarasa, Advaita as Gopishwar with Madhurya Rasa, and so forth. So the bases are covered, so to speak, in this regard. But that said, it's not something that Krishnadas Kaviraj takes up here in his book. He's concerned with more of a base conception of Advaita Acharya as an avatar of Mahavishnu and in a role of compassion and Dasya Bhakti. The two, compassion and Dasya Bhakti, are very, very different. So the lower side really is his compassion, the higher side, is his Dasya Bhakti. And with regard to the compassion, well, then his name here is Advaita. So Mahavishnu Jagat Karta Maya Yasujati Adha. He's part of the creation and so forth and so on, as we're hearing, and also his name is Advaita. And Dasya Bhakti Advaita Acharya Ishvara Advaitam Harinadvaita. So he ends the first verse, he begins the first verse by speaking about this Advaita's big guy. It's the same thing he's done when he's talked about Nityananda Prabhu. He's got 5 verses in the previous chapter of Chaitanya Charitamrita describing Nityananda Prabhu, all describing him in terms of the manifestation of the world, the expander of the Dham, the Paravyom. He's like everywhere, woven within the world. You can't get away from him. He's its support and so forth. These are people who appear in Bengal, or so it would appear. He is very bent, Krishnadas Kaviraj, on speaking about them in such a way that we do not think of them as ordinary people. And he'll go on in the narrative, and then they'll have their human-like expressions of interactions with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and the other devotees and so forth. But these two, Advaita and Nityananda, along with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, they're all directly, Vishnu Tattva is the idea. So they're the 2 Prabhus, 1 Mahaprabhu, and then everything else is the Shaktis. So the sense, in other words, that they are God, Nityananda and Advaita, he really wants to bring that out. It seems to be very much a concern on his part. And so that's what he emphasizes here. When he closes the first verse of these 2 Mangal verses of his, Tasyavataram Evayam Advaita Acharya Ishvara, he says, he begins the next one with the same Advaita Harinadvaitad. So he said, he in other words, he wants to talk about the name Advaita. His name is Advaita, he's the avatar of Mahavishnu, so on and so forth. And Advaita, as Advaita, Advaita Harinadvaita, means he is non-different from God, from Krishna. Advaita, he wants to explain the way in which the word Advaita is used. And it's interesting because the name of Advaita, as Krishnadas speaks about him in his commentary, is one in which he really wants to drive a wedge between the understanding of Advaita Vedanta and Bhakti. So Advaita Vedanta is a school of Vedanta in which there's no Bhakti. It's a school of Vedanta in which it's thought that there is no individual self, there's one self. The individual self is just a misperception. When you get over it, there's one self and it just pulsates, so to speak, in eternity. So this is not the Vaishnava understanding, nor is it a clear reading of the sacred texts. It's definitely an imposition in which ideas are imposed upon the texts, for example, by Shankara Acharya, the greatest advocate of Advaita Vedanta. So this school of thought is very, it's kind of diametrically opposed in a way to the school of Bhakti, even while there are many similarities. So a sanskar for Advaita is difficult to overcome, and develop a sanskar, a tendency for bhakti, for devotion. If the Advaita idea is based on, among other things, the knowledge that there is consciousness, and it's kind of monistic idealism. The idea is that there is no world. The world doesn't really exist. There's only Brahman. The Atma is Brahman. This is kind of it's very much world denying, and it is an advocacy of a kind of inaction. It's very, very much an advocacy that action is the problem, inaction is the solution. And bhakti, by contrast, is full of action. And that's why, for example, in bhakti school of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, even Shantarasa, which is a form of bhakti, is not considered, not given much attention. Shanta is not overtly manifest, for example, in Goloka. Therefore, Charibhav, Dasya, Sakya, Vatsalya, and Madhurya. It's just barely within bhakti. And to give it another further insight into this, Shantarasa is the one sthayi bhav for Shanta that can be changed. So it's a kind of a fence-sitting type of a position. You're sitting on the fence, which could mean you could go one way or the other, but you're totally fixated on the grass on one side. But still you're not doing anything about it. You're like, that's good grass. It really looks good. It really looks good. But dasya means get off the fence and eat the grass, and play in the grass, and so on. So the name Advaita here is not an advocacy. He's not a personification of Advaita Vedanta. Indeed, in the Leela, he stands very much against this, and very much makes an effort to establish himself, even though he's a manifestation of Mahavishnu, to be Adasya, a servitor. So he says, Advaita Harinadvaitad. He's Advaita in the sense that he's non-different from the Godhead, but not in an Advaita Vedanta sensibility. And therefore, Advaitad Harinadvaitad Acharjam Bhakti Samshanat. He's called Advaita, but we don't call him only Advaita. What do we call him? Advaita Acharya. His name is always Advaita Acharya. Advaita Acharya. Advaita Acharya. Not Advaita, Advaita. Acharya. Acharjam Bhakti Samshanat. Because he's a teacher of bhakti, which has to be taught by example. Acharya means behavior. So, as I often say, example speaks louder than precept. If I can show the example, that's going to have more power than me talking about it and setting a contradictory example, for sure. That's what the parents do, usually. That's why kids don't follow them. So he has qualified his name. He's Advaita in the sense that he's non-different than Hari. And furthermore, he's an Acharya, which means he's teaching bhakti, which further says he's not the personification of Advaita Vedanta. He's a teacher of bhakti. And by his example, Bhakta Bhataram Ishamtam Advaita Charjam Ashray. So he's both God, he says, and avatar of God, and I take shelter of him. These are the verses. So in the commentary, as I say, of Krishnadas on these verses, well, he makes the ontological, clarifies the ontological position of Advaita Acharya. He speaks a little bit about his compassionate nature in terms of calling Mahaprabhu. This is another reason, indeed, why he's called Advaita, because he made two into one. Advaita means one. He made two into one. Who are the two? Radha and Krishna are the two, and they became one as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. He made two into one and brought him to the world. Out of a desire to bestow bhakti on the people of the world, he petitioned Krishna to come, and he came in a combined form of Radha and Krishna. this compassion of Advaita, of course, is important to us, because it's kind of foundational to the life of the Vaishnava. And we see it in Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Leela, in that Advaita, out of compassion, called for Krishna to come. He came in the form of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and under the auspices of Advaita, who is, as a manifestation of Mahavishnu, the person through whom all the Yuga avatars come. Yuga avatars are the avatars for the particular yugas that teach the Dharma for the Yuga. And so there's two sides of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, as we know. The esoteric internal side, where he's Krishna pursuing the mood of Radha, the experience of Radha, and the external side where he is the Yuga avatar and distributing the method of the Yuga, chanting of the name Nam Sankirtan and so forth. So this side of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is more or less under the auspices of Advaita. He brought him to the world, and at a certain point in Puri, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was to Advaita that he turned and said, yeah, I don't think there's any more need for rice in the market, something like that. Nobody knew what he was talking about. Advaita could understand. He nodded and said yes. Which means Mahaprabhu thought, I've done the work of the Yuga avatar. I've established what the Yuga Dharma is. Now can I get on with my other business? Advaita is giving him permission. And then Mahaprabhu's life started to turn internal. The public figure of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu became more or less a recluse, a private person, and surrounded by Ramananda Roy, Swarup Damodar, as he tried to enter into the ecstasy of Radha and a contemplative type of life. He was out of the public view for the most part. And then the further dissemination of Sankirtans was given to Nityananda Prabhu and others. And so Advaita is kind of the presiding deity of the compassionate side of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. Of course, we say that Radha is the compassionate nature of Krishna, so the appearance of this desire of Krishna to taste in the experience of Radha has certain far-reaching implications for the world. It causes another Leela, and it's a very compassionate Leela. Here is Krishna in the mood of Radha and called by Advaita for bestowing bhakti. So we find that the point I'm making is that this outreach, this compassion, this sharing, if you will, that was done by Mahaprabhu through Nam Sankirtan as a public figure, was something that he, so to speak, put in place, or that a devotee following his example should see that it comes in place. And as much as this comes in place, then there will be scope for inner life. So it's not about fighting with other devotees, about whose guru is best and so forth. That's not what inner life of Raganuga Bhakti is about. This is the even the yogins and jnanis develop a sense of universal compassion because they're standing, as much as they're successful in their practice and with a little help of bhakti, on the ground of being. So this is really where the full place of compassion can be expressed. I mean, if you can give the example of a young girl. A young girl is loved by a tiger, by a young boy, and by a sage. So the tiger loves the young girl, and he's just ready to devour her. The young boy loves the young girl in another way. And the sage, mystic, also loves the young girl. He doesn't want to devour her for dinner, and doesn't want to take her out for dinner either. In either case, he has something else in mind that he sees. He sees that the Atma, the self, the real self, identifies with this, the ground of being, where being really is. I often say that having has nothing to do with being. The sense that my being is derived from having is a very vacuous sense of being and existence. We can have nothing and be much more, and oftentimes, even from materially speaking, poor people have more sense of being sometimes than wealthy people. They don't know what to do with their money, frustrated and so forth. Nobody likes them, except if they have any money. They're always worried. Somebody wants to know me. Somebody wants to talk to me. They must want something. Imagine it must be a very troublesome life. Everybody that approaches you, possibly, good chance, has some ulterior motive in mind. How would you like to be surrounded by people who only have ulterior motives in having a relationship with you? So you don't find this amongst the poorer people. I'm just giving kind of a crude example, that having being, real being, in a sense, is not derived from how much we have. It's not that now we have haves and have-nots in the world. The 99% have, and the 1%, don't have. And I'm for economic equality and so forth. But there's more to life than that. And the fullness of being is found when we can stand on the ground of being. And our identity is not defined by what we have, by our attachments, that I'm not Polish or Mexican or Swedish or Italian or North American or Central American, and so on and so forth. And obviously these identities invariably get in the way of the sense, of our sense that reality should be a union. They invariably, to one extent or another, get in the way. I mean, you may really like somebody a lot from another culture and sit down to eat and it becomes a problem. For example, here in Costa Rica they eat very bland food, and probably in Mexico it's very, you guys like the chilies over there, right? And so it's like, well, it's a problem. So anyway, so we have to go beneath the surface, right? And this is where the full, like the fountain of compassion, so to speak. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur used to say that bhajan, the internal life, spiritual culture, is performed on the canvas of Advaigyan Tattva, non-dual knowledge. So in one sense, he means rising above the dualities of material existence. Bhakti rasa, is a post-liberated reality. And bhakti rasa, in the form of dasya, sakya, vatsalya, and madhurya, is way beyond universal compassion on a ladder of love. But you won't get there by skipping over the compassion. You won't get there with your shoes on, so to speak. You have to enter in the context of bhakti. You have to enter into the ground of being what I am. To be all that I can be, I must know constitutionally is basically what I am. And what I am then gives rise to what my prospect can be in relation to bhakti. If I understand myself as Satchidananda, as Tatastha, then I know that I have some prospect in relation to bhakti. Even my self-joy, the ananda of myself, will be exceeded by bhakti ananda. It's very practical. You can be a unit of love, but if there's no one to love, then the experience of love is limited thereby. So Krishnadas in his commentary then jumps into this whole idea of the Dasya Bhakti of Advaita Acharya. It's a very Vaikuntha-esque kind of explanation that sees all forms of bhakti as really being dasya. So, for example, in Vaikuntha, if Narayana on Janamastami shows his Braj Leela there, kind of a semblance of the Braj Leela, all the Dasya Bhaktas will think that's interesting, that's nice. They like that. It's all a form of Dasya. I think it's all coming out of Dasya. Dasya is the real rasa. These are different expressions of it only. There's a tendency in Bhakti Rasa to see. There's a saying, I think it's from Bhagavad, one sees others to be like oneself. So oftentimes the faults we find in other people are our own. And if we find fault in people too much, they'll become ours. We keep meditating on the faults of others, they also become ours. So that's also a problem. But in bhakti, then, one tends to project also one's own bhakti on others. So one starts to see others as better devotees than oneself. Well, he must be a devotee. He seems like a nice person. He must be a devotee too. And with regard to rasa, we find many examples of devotees in different rasas seeing others in other rasas as if, for example, a Sakya Rasa Bhakta may think, oh, the gopis, they said this. There's nothing more beautiful than seeing Ram and Krishna and their cowherd friends and cows heading into the forest. Therefore, see, they actually want Sakya Rasa. So this is a subjective experience of example of how someone in one rasa looks at others in other rasas, as if, that is to say, their rasa is the best. And everybody must be desiring it. This is the subjective perspective. Now, with regard to the Dasya Bhakti, the interesting thing is that there's some truth to it, objective truth to it. In other words, the subjective experience that I'm a Dasya Bhakta and this is the best, and everybody really is a Dasya Bhakta when you look at it, or wants to be, or something, this kind of perspective. While it's subjective, there's some objective truth to it too, because the fact of the matter is that every form of love of Krishna arises out of a serving ego. Therefore it said, Jivera Swarup Hoy Krishna Nityadas. Every jiva is a servant of Krishna. That expresses itself as in friendly love, and romantic love, and parental love, and so forth. But it's all arising out of a serving ego. So therefore, we do put a focus on culturing the serving ego itself. And in this chapter, in his comments, I should say, on this verse, the 6th chapter of Bhagavad, Krishnadas goes speaking, kind of takes the voice of Advaita Acharya in Dasya Bhav, and says, really all the cowherd boys are really in Dasya, and really all the Nanda Maharaj is actually really a servant. And the gopis just see, he cites these different verses where you wouldn't have interpreted it like that, but from the subjective point of Dasya Bhakti, he's making that kind of projection. It's very charming in a way. And then the culmination of it all is, of course, and he goes up the ladder. I mean, the highest end of the ladder, of course, is the inhabitants of Vrindavan themselves, but the bigger people, ostensibly bigger, Sukadev, Narada, Brahma, and so he's describing them all as servants. And then he comes, of course, to himself, Mahavishnu. Examples there in the Bhagavatam. And then, of course, it culminates in what? He's making this case that everybody's really, serving Dasya Bhav is really the ideal. This is very, of course, one side point here is very relative to Gaur Leela, because everyone in Gaur Leela is a Dasya Bhakta. And he lists them, Gadadhar, Nityananda, they're all Dasya Bhaktas, in relation to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, even while they may be gopis in relation to Krishna or friends of Krishna. In relation to Mahaprabhu, this particular form of Krishna, they are in Dasya Bhava, a special kind of Dasya Bhava that makes up very much of the Gaur Leela. But besides that, as I say, on a ladder as he goes up, everyone is a servant. He culminates in not only himself. Mahavishnu desires to be a servant. Ekala Ishwar Krishna, Arsa Briti. Only Krishna is the master. Everyone the servant. All forms of divinity. And then what does it culminate in? Indeed, Krishna himself wants to taste the mood of a devotee. And for this reason he comes, and Advaita called him, and so on and so forth. So the very, very beautiful chapter, and if understood in this way, it's very powerful in terms of the aspiration to convert our enjoying ego into a serving ego, which is then the basis of bhakti, which obviously is a way of becoming like Advaita is, well, similar but different, one with Bhagavan. That's different than the idea of oneness with Brahman in Advaitavad. Of course, Advaita is one because he's Hari himself. We can be one in the context of bhakti, but here Advaita is speaking about himself as a devotee, and we can extrapolate that the kind of dynamic oneness or union with the Absolute that's possible through bhakti, which is, again, it's a dynamic form of oneness, very different than the static idea and illusory idea, really, of Advaita Vedanta, because it's not true that there are no individual souls. So, it's not true that there is no world. These are distortions of the sacred text. And of course, then, as further on the point of Dasya Bhakti, we find that what Krishnadas is saying here about Advaita Acharya in terms of his Dasya Bhakti is very much played out in the Leela. And I'll conclude with this. It was just a wonderful story of how Advaita, the lengths that Advaita went to in order to establish that he himself, who was 52 years old when Chaitanya Mahaprabhu appeared, so according to the culture, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu should have been very respectful to Advaita. By the time Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was a 20-year-old boy, Advaita Acharya was 72 years old, so you think you'd have a little respect for an elderly, saintly person. So Mahaprabhu naturally conducted himself accordingly. Vaishnava etiquette was something very important to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. It's the ornament of the devotee. So he was quite strict about that, and he showed great regard to Advaita Acharya, but it frustrated Advaita no end. Advaita had the insight. I prayed for Krishna to come. He's come. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is Krishna himself. When I was teaching Bhagavad Gita in my class, and I came in the 13th chapter, Purusha Prakriti Yoga, and there Krishna describes himself, my hands are everywhere, my legs are everywhere. How I could give a bhakti interpretation of this, it sounds very Brahman-like. At that time, in the dream at night, it was Chaitanya Mahaprabhu who came to me and said, it should be understood like this. My devotees are everywhere, and everywhere they're making offerings. And wherever they're making offerings, my hands are there, my mouths are there, and so forth. And I'm accepting a very, very, very beautiful bhakti explanation of that verse that sounds rather formless, if you will. So anyway, he had his different insights that Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is the Krishna that I called for, and so forth. Devotees, all these verses kind of go in and out of that. He is Krishna. He's the best devotee of Krishna. This is the Leela. So, reflecting on the tattva, if you will, that Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam, Krishna is the source of Narayan, Mahavishnu and so forth, Advaita, very much wanted to establish that in no uncertain terms, but Mahaprabhu was always deflecting his attempts to do so. So the measure of his frustration and the measure of his determination to make this point in the context of the Leela reached its zenith when Advaita and Shantipur began to explain the Bhagavad Gita from an Advaitin point of view, very much out of character. Mm-hmm. And Bhakti's a secondary thing, and so forth. And Bhakti keeps God at a distance, and Advaita's easier. And these kind. And so news came to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. The old man Advaita is now preaching about Gyan over Bhakti. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu had been informed, but he went there. And there he chastised Advaita very strongly. As a young man, he took him and threw him off the dais. You cannot sit on this yasana in my group and speak this kind of thing. And Nityananda was just dancing in ecstasy, relishing that Advaita's on the ground. And Sita Devi, don't stop, you'll kill him. Like it's described like very strongly there. And Advaita got up finally, and he said, I've shown. You are the master. I am the servant. So this was his joy. He went to great extremes to try to establish this position, which is the cornerstone of the philosophy of Gaudiya Vaishnavism. Krishna's two, Bhagavan Swayam. Krishna is the source of Narayan, and his Purusha avatars, the Vishnus, and so on and so forth. So the chapter ends, I'm Chaitanya Das. I'm a servant of Chaitanya, servant of Chaitanya, servant of Chaitanya. Everybody should be. That's very powerful advocacy of Dasya Bhakti in relation to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and, of course, to Krishna, of course, as well. But in Gaur Leela, it's very much the case. We know the Goswamis, for example, their ideal is Manjari Bhav, to be a handmaiden of Radha and Krishna Leela, and the corresponding Swarup in which they are eternally manifested in Gaur Leela is one of a young Brahmin boy in Dasya Bhakti. Mahaprabhu is Krishna in his Acharya Leela, so he's teaching about Krishna. In the eternal Navadvip, he's always doing Krishna Kirtan, worshipping Krishna with the devotees and so on and so forth. So there's a special kind of Dasya Bhakti. And this chapter very much emphasizes that. Śrī Advaita Acharya ki jai. Advaita Acharya Prabhupada Mahamosavati ki jai. Gaur Bhakti Vrinda ki jai. Gaur Premanande.